The Canadian news industry is struggling with large mergers, bankruptcies, and layoffs. Access to quality news in Canada is less accessible and more expensive. In response to this, the government introduced a very controversial piece of legislation called the Online News Act, or Bill C-18, which aims to force larger platforms like Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and Google to pay for the Canadian news on their platforms. While this sounds like a fairly straightforward idea, there has been a lot of controversy and strong disagreement over this issue. Hello and welcome back to Political Debrief. I'm your host, Josh Oliverio. Today, we are talking about Bill C-18 and how it impacts young Canadians. Joining me to chat about this is the Liberal Member of Parliament for Kitchener-Conestoga and member of the Canadian Heritage Committee, Tim Lewis. Here's our conversation now. Today we're here to talk about Bill C-18, the Online News Act. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details, do you want to explain what is the Online News Act? Why should young people care about it?
Sure. The Online News Act, otherwise known as C-18, we've got all sorts of numbers for legislation that has just been enacted. I can start by saying the importance, and having this conversation with you is something that I respect. As long as there are stories out there, we're going to need people to tell them. And as a young person yourself, I imagine it's got to be scary, challenging kind of time to enter journalism. When what we're seeing in journalism now, we're seeing layoffs, we're seeing closures of newspapers, and respectable, established journalism is being challenged right now. And what the biggest challenge is the ad revenue. Right now, a digital ad, and we know that things are switching from paper to digital. The medium is changing, but the stories need to still be there. So as things are switching to digital, there are two companies in the world that make 80 to almost 90% of all of the digital revenue in the world. And that would be Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, and Google. And so what's happening is they're using the stories that local journalists are telling, and they're putting them on their feeds, and those two companies are making the revenue off of the work of the local journalists. And so the journalism established journalists are not getting the revenue, and that's why they're closing. And so C-18, which is the Online News Act, is going to level that playing field. What we're asking Meta, Google, and Facebook, and Instagram, and Google to do is to sit down and negotiate some terms and say part of just a small fraction of the revenue that Facebook and Google are making that should be shared with those news organizations so they can continue to have those stories to tell, which will benefit Facebook and Google because that's going to go on their platforms themselves.
So there's been a lot of confusion over this bill, even from my reading and my understanding. It's kind of evolved a little bit. So maybe you can clarify for us when you say Meta and Google are using content. What exactly do you mean by that, or what exactly does the bill mean by that?
The idea is that people are reading those stories through the links that are on those feeds, through either Google searches or through your Facebook or Instagram feeds. And when you're looking at those links and you're looking at those stories, your eyes are on their product, their platform. And while they're on that platform of Google or Facebook or Instagram, it's their ads that the customers are seeing. And when you're seeing those ads, that's the revenue that they're generating. People are paying to put those ads on Facebook and Google, and that's money that's going offshore to these internet giants who are making, I can't remember, something like $500 billion a year or something like that, something obscene, where they're not necessarily giving back to anything in Canada. Here, there are some programs that they are saying they're using for journalism, but most of that money, almost all of it, is going to those foreign companies, even though they're using the information and the stories from journalism. I guess if I were to turn it into music, you can listen to my music on iTunes or Spotify. Well, what happens is if you listen to one of the songs that I wrote, yes, the revenue for the ad, people are watching ads or paying for a subscription in this case, if it's ad free, that money goes to those companies, Spotify, iTunes. But I get a small very small cut, but at least it's something back. And that's how artists are able to do. For streaming, there's a bit of a, okay, some of the artists get some money back. But with news, that's not the case. And so we're asking, we don't want to pick winners or losers. There's no way we're going to say how much they need to pay. We're asking those tech giants to sit down with these newspapers, whether they're big themselves at Tour Stars or your Post Media, or if they're smaller local newspapers that we have to have and that we need, they can collectively bargain. We're saying sit down and negotiate. And if something fair, if you guys negotiate a fair price, that's fantastic. And if you don't negotiate something that you can both agree on, then we're going to ask you to sit down at the table until it's done. That's the gist of it. So to make sure that those journalists can still tell our stories.
Yeah, and I think that it's for me at least as a semi-journalist, it's been interesting to kind of see both sides of this. I'm going to read for you what Google said about C18. It says the government of Canada enacted a new law called the Online News Act, requiring two companies to pay for simply showing links to news. So by that quote, it seems like Google and Meta have said similar things, that they're frustrated that the government is forcing them to pay for something that users post, not that Facebook posts, that like at Josh Oliverio posts a CBC News link. Why should Facebook have to pay for what I post on my Facebook feed?
I think they should pay because they're generating revenue ad from your work. That's what it comes down to, is that you're not going to your website to see the stories. They're using that to keep people's attention on their sites. And if people's attention is on their sites, then people are looking at their ads, and then they can make more money from that. So we're just making sure that we're creating this framework that the Canadian publishers, whether they're big or small companies, just can negotiate a fair deal that just keeps it a bit more equal with those tech giants who are, again, 80 to 90% of all the advertising revenue in the world is going to two companies. And I think that Canada's on the forefront. We're one of the first countries in the world. Australia has started this by about a year ahead of us. We're one of the first countries in the world to do this. So the rest of the world is watching to see what happens. And these tech giants, they don't want any kind of legislation in other countries. They don't want to pay for news content that they're already making money from, even though they didn't generate that content.
So the bill was passed by the Senate before everything rose for the summer. The bill doesn't come into force until the fall, but Facebook has already made the decision that they're going to start removing news altogether on their platforms, including Instagram and Facebook. Google hasn't yet, but they've said that they will if XYZ doesn't get changed. Do you think that this bill has had kind of a reverse effect than what it was trying to do? The bill was designed to kind of promote and preserve journalists and news, but now news isn't available on the largest social media site in Canada. Do you think that it's kind of had a reverse effect than what you guys intended?
I would sort of reverse that and say, what does that kind of bully tactic tell us? That we're talking about a fraction, maybe a small percentage, 2, 3% of what they're making, going back to journalists here in our country and eventually in other countries as well, to preserve that journalism so we can tell our stories. That kind of bully tactics to me, saying we don't even want to talk, we just want to block this information. And they did that with Australia. They did that about a year or two ago. Australia's about a year ahead of us with this legislation, and they did that during forest fire season. They did that during when there was pandemic information that needed to get out there. They're blocking the very news that people need to see, and they were doing it on purpose to make up to state to send out a message. That kind of bully tactics, to me, tell me we're on the right side. That this is a David and Goliath thing, and these countries are the smaller players, and these international giants, these web giants that aren't paying practically anything. Um, they're going to be trying to extort us and play this game of chicken. So I think, if anything, we should be holding our ground, and other countries are already coming up with legislation that's going to catch up. We need to hit that critical mass that we can stand up and say, you need to pay your fair share.
And besides Bill C-18, which is coming into law in the fall, what are some other ways that the government is supporting the Canadian news industry?
Yeah, it's a good question, Josh, because it's not just about one thing that we're doing. This bill, it already builds on existing supports that we're helping journalism already as a Canadian government. We've got a program called the Local Journalism Initiative. We've got the the Canadian Periodical Fund that exists. We've got a journalism labor tax credit, and we have a digital news subscription tax credit. So there's a suite of programs that we're already doing to make sure we promote journalism, especially at a local level. We need that free, independent press to keep governments. To hold them to task, to let people know what information is out there, to tell our stories. And so, between those programs, like I said, the LJI, the Canadian Periodical Fund, tax credit for label journalism, and the digital news subscription tax credit, that's part of the suite. And now we're asking these companies to sit down and negotiate with the journalism companies as well.
Another interesting thing, and the statistics are not accurate because I don't have them in front of me, but it was something along the lines of there was a poll done in Canada. Less than 1% of Canadians pay for any news at all. Do you think that there's also a responsibility on Canadians to take the initiative and support high quality journalism?
That's a fantastic question, and that's comes down to, I imagine, an ethical question, right? Like, you get more of what you support. And so what you're saying is, should we as a society support journalists more? I would say the answer is yes. And again, maybe I turn this back to being a musician. I'll take you back probably a bit before your time. Before there was streaming, there was piracy with music. You'd put an album out, and next thing you know, someone's pushed a few buttons, and you're getting $0 from it. People had learned that you can just there was no value placed to music, and people were ripping off albums that were costing a lot of money to make, and people were downloading them for free. It took a while before the industry sat down, before society caught up and said, again, you get more of what you support. And in that case, streaming came, and maybe the pendulum didn't swing back as far because, again, when you were selling a physical album or you were selling a single for 99 cents on Apple Music as a musician, and all of a sudden now it becomes a streaming service, you're certainly not getting paid as much as you used to. And that's a conversation for a different day. But at least the pendulum it didn't stay there with piracy. And I think the question you bring up, Josh, about how much should we make sure that we support journalism more is a valid question. And I think that people need to realize that our local journalists are the people that are the parents, of the kids that they go to school with you, and they're supporting your business in other ways. If you own a restaurant, they're the ones eating there. So these journalists are telling stories, and as someone in your case wants to get into a career about this, you want to make sure that you can make a living doing this. You don't want to be out there and get a degree, work hard, and then in a job that's has a separate skill set from where you're at. So I think the short answer is, yeah, I think society should realize that we need to respect those journalism, and maybe the fact that Facebook and it is playing hardball and threatening to take our stories away from us when we're looking through these feeds, maybe that will rally the Canadians to say that our local journalism is important, and we want our stories to be told, and we want to hear them.
All right, Tim Lewis, thanks so much for coming on Political Debrief.
You make this so fantastic. I really appreciate what you do, Josh. Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of Political Debrief. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested, I would invite you to check out my full interview with Tim Lewis, where we talk a little bit about his past career in music. He was a musician for a long time. And also our rapid fire round, where he answers some questions like whether or not he's going to seek re-election. Take a listen to that if you're interested. Please follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Josh Oliverio, and I would invite you to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and see ya on the next episode.